without any further ado, T2 manufacturing. So this class is going to be going through the incredibly complicated and often unnecessarily so world of doing T2 manufacturing. So as I go through this, I'm going to walk through sort of my process for how I do manufacturing, what I think about, how I go through the steps, and how I decide what I'm going to build, and then go through any set of examples on how you actually do that construction. So this giant list of skills is a big part of why people tend to find T2 a little intimidating, along with this lovely flowchart from eUni that, as you can see, doesn't make it very simple to understand what's involved in the process. So I'm going to try to sort of break it down a little bit more simply into its core components. At its core, T2 manufacturing has basically 4 pieces: invention, reactions, the T2 components themselves, and then the base item. Those 4 pieces all combine together in the T2 blueprint to generate the actual ship and the actual item itself. So as you're going through, we're going to walk through each of those different steps, but I highly recommend thinking about them as being totally separate and distinct pieces. Invention is its own self-contained piece. Reactions are their own self-contained piece. The T2 components, again, its own piece to it. And then obviously the base item, it's a normal ship like you'd build any other method. And the reason why I recommend that is because you don't have to do all of it yourself. At any point during this process, you can just buy it off the shelf and you will still be able to make profits or sell just that one piece and still be able to make some profits. So the first and probably most important step when you're going through and doing this is to actually select what is the item I'm going to make. Now, there's a bunch of different tools out there to do this, but personally, I like Lazy Blacksmith. The address for it is up here. I'm going to toss it in the fleet so that you've got it there as well. But my first step, anytime I'm looking at a project, is to go here, open up the item I want to look at, and today I'm going to be looking at mostly the Ares. You'll click on this manufacture button, and it'll take you into this main screen. Now, I suspect most of you have used this before for other manufacturing, but just in case you haven't, this is a really in-depth tool to give you a quick sense and overview of everything that goes into the product that you're going to build. It lets you select where you're going to build it, what system you're going to build it in, whether that system is high, low, or nullsec, and the rigs that are on your station. If you own the blueprints, you can actually pull them in automatically with the ME and TE levels, or you can set them yourselves, along with adjusting your skills and what's involved in the process. For me, this gives you a quick sense, and I'll be using this a lot more later, but this screen is the most important item when I start doing my determination of, do I want to build this thing? And this, the margins and markup, is why we're all here. So what this tells you is that assuming that you are buying all of your raw materials for G to buy prices and selling at G to sell prices, you will make basically 30% off of your purchase into the items themselves. That 30% means that a million ISK is now 1.3, 2 million, 2.6, and so on and so forth for every single item that you build You buy the old one, sell the new one, and make $6 million for an Aries in profits. Now, as I said, this sheet is just a first snapshot. And I look at this before I look at anything else because I want to find out, is it worth doing more research? Should I bother to look at this in depth and in detail? These margins, you'll find, can be all over the place. So the Aries, I've already done my research and I know that it's profitable, which is why I selected it for this class. But there are plenty of items that when you open them up, such as the Atron itself, you actually lose money every time you make an Atron. 6%. Not a lot, but there are definitely items out there that you don't want to bother making. And this is how you do that first quick check. Is it worth me looking into it even further? And that's why I do this as my first sort of quick check to go through that process. If I get a positive number, say 15 to 20%, I'll start looking at it in more detail. But if it's something below, for me personally, 5 to 10%, although you all will find your own margins that are acceptable and worth your time, I won't even bother doing the rest of the next steps. Once I have a candidate, I'll actually do a manual check as well. You don't have to do this. If the Lazy Blacksmith says it's profitable, you're probably going to be fine making it yourself. But since the prices in an impasse can be all over the place, I like to then take a step back and go actually look at, if I buy it in impasse, what's it going to cost me? So again, using the Aries as an example, I pulled off of the blacksmith. What items do I need? What is the full set of raw materials that I'm going to be using to build it? And then I open up and just put that list into a spreadsheet, and you can slot in what is the price right now in impasse, because I'm building an impasse, to build this item. And sometimes you'll find, for example, crystalline carbonide not available for sale in impasse. So I'll have to use the G to price and the assumption for that, which is under prices, 160 per unit. That's pretty reasonable as sort of a starting point. Once you get deeper into that sort of process, you're going to want to make sure that you look at what are your actual costs to either buy or make these materials. So it gets kind of in the weeds if you want to go through and do the math in detail, which is why that first step for me is always to start with G to prices. What's it look like? Is it worth me doing all the extra effort to do that level of analysis, do my research, and start looking into it in depth? If the G to prices say that it's profitable, absolutely. Let's take a look. Let's see what I can get the materials for, because sometimes I can't get G to buy prices. Realistically, building these is going to cost me maybe 180. When you've got all of those built out, you'll be able to determine, is this item profitable for me to make? Not just in GITA, but is it profitable for me to make here in impasse or in GE, where my prices might be a little different. So I go through that step to do kind of an initial check and then look a little more deeply into that manual process. Now, this is pretty straightforward. You just copy the quantities, look up the price, and there you go. When you're done, you'll have a final cost for the item. There are tools out there that do a much more thorough job. They are not mandatory. You can make money and make T2 items without ever touching a spreadsheet like this, and quite frankly, without ever touching a spreadsheet at all. When you want to really understand and start tracking it, I assure you, you will find yourself leaning more and more toward these types of sheets. And the reason why I say that is because they have built in a lot more tools for you to be able to use. For example, databases of item IDs to do quick lookups. You can do what are the actual blueprints for various items to go through and do that. And you can also use them to do automatic pulls of your assets, corporations' assets if you're doing it for them. You can get price pulls on market prices. So, for example, when I set one of these up, I did just a simple setup. I'm going to build hounds. Bombers, they're pretty profitable. They're reasonably straightforward to go through and do. I've set it up so that I'm going to do 20 runs, and that will tell me as you go through how many reactions are you going to need, how much ore are you going to need, and what's the total materials that you're going to want to go through that build process. For 20 of them, how many of these T2 shield emitters, how many of these capacitors, and once you've built all of those, again, you're doing this setup and this start just to decide, is it worth my time to build this item? By far, the longest amount of time that you will spend in any part of the manufacturing process is deciding, what am I going to build? Is it worth my time? And what do I need to actually go through and do that? So as you go in through that process, it is, yep, it's on Twitch. You're gonna hop in through the link in the fleet. So as you go through this process, the front end analysis is the overwhelming majority of it. And you can get to the point where you've got these types of very complicated, involved spreadsheets that build out every single step, that tell you exactly how much you need, which parts of it are profitable, which parts aren't. But in the end, when you're looking at these, it can be as simple as, I need an Aries, is 30% profitable, I'm going to go build them. You don't have to do it with that level of spreadsheet analysis. You can simply look for these types of items through this type of database, and there are some others, but I like this one, so it's the one you're all getting today, to just decide, am I going to build it? Does it make sense? Once you've made that decision, that's where we start getting into each of those different steps. So once you've decided what you're going to build, you're going to need a blueprint. I highly recommend that you start by using the free blueprints through the dojo and through the BPC program. I like free stuff. You should like free stuff. And it's a great way to get yourself started. 10 per day goes a long way to going through and getting these types of options going. And there really isn't a reason not to use that program, because it's a really great tool to get you started. So once you've decided, I'm going to build an Aries, it's profitable, I know kind of what it needs, that means that I need to go get the BPC. Again, this interface is a great tool to help you make that decision. So invention is at its core very straightforward. You take a T1 blueprint, you take two different kinds of data cores, and you take an optional decryptor and you press go. And when you press go, it will start a timer, and at the end of the timer you have a percentage chance to spit out a Tech 2 blueprint of your choice. I'll show you in the game what that interface looks like, but I want to emphasize planning when you go through that process, because a lot of this stuff can get very expensive, so you want to know ahead of time what it is you're going to be making and how you go through that decision process. So, the data cores are very simple. Every BPC to do the invention process has a fixed set of data cores. For ships, all of them will be the Starship Engineering for that race, and then one of the sciences. Whether it's high energy physics, it might be nuclear engineering, it might be mechanical engineering, they're all going to be specific to that item, and you can look up ahead of time, which science skill do I need? Those skills can be a bit of a stepping stone for getting into it, because you will eventually need a pretty wide variety of science skills. But as you can see, you don't need them to be maxed out. You can take those skills to level 3 or maybe 4, and for almost all of them, that can be done in a day of training, and for not a lot of upfront investment cost. So if you want to start getting into it, there is a little bit of startup time to do so, but it's not a huge task to get yourself to the point where you can do it. So once you know the data cores, you can either go collect them from various data sites throughout Impasse and throughout Catch or Aquarius or wherever you happen to be living. You can buy them off the market. They're about 100,000 a piece if you buy them in Jita. They're not super expensive, and they're incredibly low volume, so they're very cheap to ship in. Personally, I buy all of mine off the market and they get them shipped in because the freight services can do it for very cheap. Since somebody asked about it, I will put a link for the various spreadsheets into the fleet once I'm done. The one that I will link is this public version. I recommend that you make a copy of it for yourself to play around in it. This public version is basically a blank one. I'm not going to say it's the best, because it's got a bunch of things that it does automatically that I want to do manually, but it's a great starting point to be able to use as your reference. Sorry, I just noticed the question. I want to make sure I got it answered. The hard part about invention, to get back on that, is these decryptors. There's a bunch of different kinds, and they all have different prices, they all have different availabilities, and figuring out what's the best one for me can trip people up a little bit. Once again, outside tools are your friends. So, Lazy Blacksmith will tell you, if I use an augmentation decryptor, I will get a 10-run BPC with a 22% chance of success. What that means is if I run 100 invention cycles, I will get 22 or 23, approximately, Ares blueprints with 10 runs each. As far as my costs go, that means that each blueprint run adds 800,000 to my costs. My Ares will be 800,000 ISK more expensive because of what it cost me to make the blueprint. With an accelerant decryptor, yeah, I'm only going to do 2 runs, but my odds go up, and that means that it's actually cheaper per run to do it with the accelerant rather than the augmentation. For something like an Aries, where the material costs are pretty low, you'll pretty quickly realize that this product price doesn't change very much. It changes some, 500,000, between the augmentation and the parity decryptors, but to go through and do it on larger runs, sometimes you'll find that it's much more valuable. So, for example, if I'm going to go and make, let's see if I've got something big. If I'm going to make an Anshar, a jump freighter, you can get 600 million in difference between the price for your various processes. And all of a sudden, which decryptor you use gets really complicated, as you want to spend a lot of time thinking about, all right, sure, it's going to cost me 150 million to do my invention run, but every success is going to save me 300 million on the back end. That's worth it to do. And I can't do that math for you. There's too many things involved in it. It gets too complicated. And quite frankly, I'm not going to tell you which things I'm building in mass, because then the market prices will fluctuate as well. The T2 markets in general are subject to a lot of volatility, because you're not going to find them as being really high volume. Yes, your strat-op doctrines are going to sell pretty frequently, but the pricing on them may not be the best. So I highly encourage you, do your research. Spend time looking through what are the margins, what does it sell for, where I'm going to build it, so that you can make that decision yourself. This is not a market class, and I probably should have started with that, but since that marketability plays into it, I highly recommend that when you're doing this research process, you spend some time making that decision. So once you've gone and done your research, and you know what it is you want to make, a jump freighter, you can get 600 million in difference between the price for your various processes. And all of a sudden, which decryptor you use gets really complicated, as you want to spend a lot of time thinking about, all right, sure, it's going to cost me 150 million to do my invention run, but every success is going to save me 300 million on the back end. That's worth it to do. And I can't do that math for you. There's too many things involved in it. It gets too complicated. And quite frankly, I'm not going to tell you which things I'm building in mass, because then the market prices will fluctuate as well. The T2 markets in general are subject to a lot of volatility, because you're not going to find them as being really high volume. Yes, your strat-op doctrines are going to sell pretty frequently, but the pricing on them may not be the best. So I highly encourage you, do your research. Spend time looking through what are the margins, what does it sell for, where I'm going to build it, so that you can make that decision yourself. This is not a market class, and I probably should have started with that, but since that marketability plays into it, I highly recommend that when you're doing this research process, you spend some time making that decision. So once you've gone and done your research, and you know what it is you want to make, what I was saying is that invention, I tend to do through the industry screen. And that's because you can do it entirely remotely. You don't have to deal with anything. So I've already got a set of Atrons queued up. I'm going to be building Ares. When you do that selection, some items, you'll have a choice about which version you're going to build. So make sure you're selecting the one you want. If you remember, the price difference wasn't enormous for the various decryptors, but for me, and based on what I have as stockpiles, the attainment decryptor made sense. It's cheaper on the net than if I were to do it as just empty, and you can do it as just empty with no decryptor at all. But we found that the attainment is a little better. You'll queue it up. The number of job runs is the number of invention attempts. So when I do this, each success will generate a 5-run blueprint. But I'm going to try it 1 time, or I can try it 5 times. Now, I personally can't, because I don't have the Galente skills set up to do so. But if I were to do it with a slasher to build a stiletto instead, go back to 1 run, set an attainment decryptor, you'll see that you're able to set it up. And that's just because I'm set up for Minmatar. For me, I already had it set, so it skipped over that stage. But when you select the blueprint, you're going to want to make sure you go to Invention, which is the little microscope, so that you enter into this screen. Once you've started that blueprint, it'll run, it'll enter your job screen, and you'll see 6 hours to do a stiletto. Once that's done, we'll get into the next step of it, which is going through that additional process. But that's the first step. That is the easiest, in many ways, part of getting the process going. Invention, once you finish that, we move into the next step of this process, which is going to be doing the reactions. So reactions tend to trip a lot of people up. And I definitely understand why, because they get really complicated really quickly. I found this is a really good, simple way to how about now? We should fix the echo. This is a really good, simple way to get your sense of items for what goes into these. And if you're familiar with doing this for PI, it's going to look very similar. Your blueprint, when you go through and do the selection, is going to show you this set of raw materials. So I need, for Galente, a whole bunch of crystalline carbide. Crystalline carbide is made up of 2 simple reactions, carbon polymers and crystallite alloy. Those in turn are made up from 4 different kinds of moon goo. That's true of most of the reactions, is that they are made up of a set of simple items. Well, all of them are made up of a set of simple items and a set of raw moon goo. For some of the more complicated ones, the goo and simple reactions, you can have quite a few of them that go into it as they get more involved. So what I strongly recommend when you start looking at these is work backward. don't start out trying to figure out what is all the goo that I need. Figure out I need 1,000 crystal carbide. All right, to make 1,000 crystal carbide, I need 500 carbon polymers. To make carbon polymers, I need hydrocarbons and silicons. That simplifies it a whole lot for when you start sourcing your goo to do T2 production. And as I said, you don't have to do the reactions. The composite materials themselves are available on the markets. You can buy them in Jita, you can buy them in Amar, you can buy them on the marketplace, you can buy them through Slack. There's nothing wrong with buying the composites and doing that and letting somebody else deal with the headache that is reactions. If you want to do the reactions, all reactions require fuel blocks. They require a formula that is like a BPC, like a BPO. They have an infinite number of runs. All of these simple reactions require a 10 million formula that's purchasable from NPCs in ISEC. All composite reactions are a 20 million formula, again from ISEC. When you go to do those reactions, and I'm going to switch back over and hopefully not lose the sound, but when you do those reactions, once again, it's through the industry screen. And they work just like doing a set of construction. You'll see I have the goo requirements, the fuel block. I've already got the formula, and so it's going to spit out 5,000 carbon polymers. All of your reactions have a fixed ratio of how much input to how much output, and it's never going to be exactly the same. I don't bother trying to get it exactly balanced. You'll notice I've got 12,000 of the hydrocarbons, 5,000 silicates. I don't have nearly enough fuel blocks to do that many. So just look at it, and when you do your analysis at the beginning, figure out how many of these do I need, and that's where those really complicated spreadsheets are helpful. They can give you outputs that show exactly where, what those ratios are. Personally, I don't tend to use them. I tend to buy my materials. I'll do the reactions as a totally separate process, and I look at the reactions on their own for whether or not those are profitable. Once you've got these reactions open, the skills for them are just reactions, which reduces the time, mass reactions, which increases how many you can do at the same time, and remote reactions, which lets you do them not in the same station. Since I spend so much time in PCMA, I haven't bothered with remote reactions, and I'm working on scaling up to do more at the same time because it's valuable. And you'll notice once I start this run, they take a really long time. Just for this small run, you're looking at a day of waiting. Once you get into really large projects, like the jump freighter I'm doing, it's months of time to process the reactions. But those reactions at their core are still pretty straightforward to go through and do. You look up the inputs, it'll give you the outputs, and you go through them step by step. So that was one of the simple reactions. Once you've got a set of simple reactions, you'll then use those to do more complicated reactions, to generate these actual composites that are going to be used. Again, you'll have a set of materials that go into it. You've got the fuel block. Each one will require a different ratio fuel block: oxygen, helium, hydrogen, nitrogen. Again, I cannot emphasize enough how much of this just comes down to do your research ahead of time so that you figure out what you want to make. Once you've figured out what is a profitable item, the actual construction itself is pretty straightforward. You just work inputs and go through the steps. So again, formula, you'll take these simple materials and run it into a composite. One trap that I will warn you about: no one buys simple materials. No one sells them. Anybody who's bothering to do the reactions is going to do them all the way through. So don't look at the pricing for these intermediate steps. The pricing in GDA is wrong. It's a lie. Nobody's buying them. Don't look at them. Don't worry about them. Just look at going from the raw goo all the way up to the components and composites themselves. Once you've got those composites, the next step is to build the T2 components. So those T2 components, again, we can go back to our blacksmith and it tells us the component blueprints. So every single T2 project is going to be made up of the raw item itself, some sort of RAM. These will be made with minerals. And then a set of T2 components. The components themselves are all specific to each different race. So unfortunately, if you go out and buy a set of BPOs for Galente ships, it's not going to help you build Minmatar. So you're going to want to either get them from the BPC program, because the BPC program will spit out 4,000 runs, and that's enough to make a lot of items. Or, again, pick a thing to make as your thing. I started out doing most of it as ammo because it's straightforward, reasonably profitable, but I learned that I can single-handedly crash the cheetah market because people don't buy that many of the missiles I was making. These components, when you look at them, will tell you you need 13 crystal carbide, 3 composites, and 1 ferrogel. The ratios for going through and building them are all unique, and so you'll find that there's one of the simple moon composites that go in and make the bulk of what you're going to be building. And then a bunch of these smaller items that are much more expensive. Each of these components work exactly like a ship blueprint. So we go back into the game itself. Back into the industry screen. And open up. Let's find graviton pulse. So these are the components that go into making a set of missiles. And it's the one thing I'm missing. I've got the morphite, I've got some of the components, I've got the PI materials. I'll get to those in a second. I just need the component. The components, again, are made up of the same sets of these composite materials. They're going to require a science skill, and unfortunately, all of those science skills are different. I recommend deciding what you're going to build as your first item, getting the BPCs through the program for free, and then again, work backward. Decide the item you're going to build, get the BPCs for the components, get the reactions for the composite materials, get the moon goo. By working backward that way, you start with the cheapest part of the process, and you don't wind up buying a ton of stuff before you know what you're going to actually be doing for that process. The industry side of it, you'll notice these take industry slots, not reaction slots, which means you can run a lot more of them. And again, these parts are generally quite quick to go through and do. I can spit out 240 of these in about 2 hours. Once you've started doing the components, you're ready for the last step, which is to do the blueprint itself. The item itself, as I said, will require the T1 version. You can either build it yourself, or you can buy it off of other people making them in mass. That's a personal choice. You're already going to have BPCs for the item. You can buy them off the market. You can buy them from new bros just looking to get industry started, or you can make them yourself. Your call. In general, I recommend starting by buying them, but if you want to make it from scratch, I'm not going to tell you it's wrong. Sorry about that. Every T2 item is going to require some sort of PI material. For ships, it is overwhelmingly construction blocks. But you noticed for the missiles I was doing, it's rocket fuel. Those PI items, again, you can make it yourself, or you can buy them on the market. Pretty straightforward to buy. If you're doing lots of T2 production, you'll burn through an astronomical amount of PI materials if you're trying to source it yourself. Sorry, 1 second. Every T2 material will also require morphite. Morphite is super cheap to buy in Impasse because it is only available, or Catch, because it is only available in Nullsec. That may change with the upcoming mineral changes, but in general, I find it's best to either buy or mine it yourself, because it's very easy to get boatloads of the stuff. The components, you're going to have manufactured this set of components to go through to build the item. And then when you look at the blueprint, instead of looking at minerals to build them, you're going to be looking at... So that's the last step in going through to build those items. Is to pull up to build the item yourself. So your blueprints, once you finish doing the invention, will show you your set of items that are required to go through. You'll build that set of components off the either BPCs or BPOs. You'll have all of them in your hangar or sorting them accordingly. The RAM is just another BPC. It's just another, oh that's right, they don't spell it the right way. It's made with minerals. You can crank out a ton of them to go through that process. And just think of it mentally as being the same as the components, except it uses minerals instead of T2 composites. Once you've got the composites, you're ready to go. And you'll just hit start. The skills to build the item itself will require advanced ship construction, small, medium, large, and the racial starship engineering, along with, again, one science skill. So the skills to get started can be a bit of a sticking point, but in a day, you can get most of them to 3. And this is where that work backwards comes in. Start with the item you want to build. Look at the components that go into it. Look at the reactions that are required. Look at the moon goo to make it. And that's the full process all the way forward. And you can do that step by step for each individual item. And that will let you build your first one. I don't recommend diving into the deep end and saying, I'm going to build 1,000 of these. I recommend saying, a saber's profitable, the goons are really stupid, they lose a lot of them, everybody loves having them around, let's build one. Do the invention, get your BPC, work through each of the components, and then, once you're ready, click start, and you're on your way. I know I've done a ton of talking, you can hear it in my voice, so I'm going to open up to questions. I'd ask that you put it in fleet to start, because you're a little delayed, and then I'll give responses. I'll read out the question so that everybody's got it for the video. No questions. That surprises me, but hopefully that means you've got a good sense of how that process goes through to go through these. And the folks that are asking for the links, I'm going to dump them as sort of a set here. Somebody was asking, what is carbon used for? I have no idea. Absolutely none. When I talk about working backwards, I look at them, so if it doesn't go into an item that I'm making, I don't care what it goes to, and I don't tend to look at it. Starting points. I started with T2 ammunition. And the reason why is it is pretty cheap to go through and do as a starting point. And when I looked, I found that it was reasonably profitable. I'm really hesitant to give you a specific item to go make because I want to emphasize how important it is to do the research yourself. Start by doing research and finding out what items are profitable, and then work backward. One person asked, does the ME of the original blueprint matter? Not for invention. The only thing that affects invention is the decryptor. The BPCs you can get through the Brave BPC program. I will provide a link to that in just a second in the fleet. Are there any other questions? I want to make sure that I've kind of governed that. And like I said, I started with T2 ammo. You can look at that as a starting point, but the one thing I want you to take away from this is that T2 is an activity that takes place 75% as research. You'll notice that I spent several hundred million, and I did it in about 30 seconds. The actual in-game portion of this is very quick and very straightforward. Systems to build in the one you like. Do your research based on where you are. But both PZMA and GE have different markets, but they're both very viable. As far as importing versus buying locally versus mining, personal choice 100% all the way. Just make sure that you do your calculation on what is your profit margin for that specific item. If you've got something like a 30% margin, you've got a ton of room to play. If you're doing something that's very narrow, you may not have as much room to play. I'm going to give folks another minute or so just in case they have any other questions. I think that I've answered all of them as they come up, but if you have any more, please feel free. As I said, T2 is a lot more thinking and a lot less doing. Start by doing your research. Obviously, you've got a snapshot into some of the items that I've done, but there's a lot of other items there, and don't think that just because I'm making it, it's the best thing to do. Yes, reactions are only available as BPOs. The other thing I will warn you, and you may have gotten a sense of this, spinning up a T2 project takes a while. It takes a lot of analysis, and you'll wind up doing a lot of runs. So if you decide, I want to make sabers, probably you're looking at making them and making the decision starting at least a week before you actually start printing them off. I'm going to put up the links one last time, just as sort of a rapid fire here at the end. And then I'm going to call it a day. I appreciate you guys coming out. There is a feedback form from the dojo that I would really appreciate if you guys can fill out for me.